So in the second part of the tutorial, we are going to learn how to store our list of items permanently in our device. In App Inventor, to store any data locally, we have to use a database called TinyDB. So I'm going to go to Designer and add a TinyDB component from this storage. I'm going to rename it and I'm going to call it Shopping List TinyDB. So if I go to Blocks Editor and click on my TinyDB component now, as you will see, there are ways to store a value in TinyDB and then retrieve that value that we have stored at a later time. So in order for us to store any data in TinyDB, we have to give it a name, and in TinyDB the name of the chunk of data that we are storing is called tag. So a tag identifies any data that we are storing. So over here, when we are adding an item to the list, what we want to do is each time we add an item to the list, we want to store that entire list in our device's local memory. So what I did was I went to this TinyDB and dragged this tinydb.storeValue method. So I'm going to give this data a name, and I'm going to call it list of items tag. So this is the tag under which my list is going to be saved. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this to select this global list of items block and hit Ctrl+C and Ctrl+V on my keyboard to duplicate that block. I'm going to snap that block to my value to store, and I'm going to place this within my enter button.click event. So now when user clicks the enter button, this code is going to grab the item from the text box and it's going to insert that to my list. It's going to clear up the text box. It's going to display my current list in the Listview component, and then it's going to save the entire list into my TinyDB. So each time I add a new item, I'm going to save that in my TinyDB. Now, kind of the reverse thing needs to happen when I'm removing something from the list. When I'm removing something from my list, I also need to store the new list with the item removed in my TinyDB again. So over here, what I'm going to do is copy and paste this whole block in my Listview.afterpicking event as well. Now this takes care of saving my current list in a TinyDB. However, when I have this app, when I close this app and let's say I open this app back again, after 2 days, I want to read all my data from my TinyDB and repopulate my current list with all the old data that I had saved. In order for us to be able to do that, what we need to do is we want to go to screen 1 and then drag this screen1.initialize event. So whenever the app starts up, this screen1.initialize is called. So whenever my app is starting up, what I want to do is I want to read from my TinyDB, and if I get some data from my TinyDB, I want to take that data and place that in my list of items. So in order for us to read the data that we have stored in our TinyDB, we will have to use the tinydb.getValue block. So now notice over here we have to specify the tag that we want to use to read our data. So the tag that we used over here, I'm going to Ctrl+C and Ctrl+V to copy and paste that tag, and I'm going to place that tag over here. I'm going to delete this block, and if we don't get any value out of TinyDB at that point, what we want to do is we want this tinydb.getValue to return an empty list. Since we stored a list, we either want a proper list or we want an empty list. So now what we want to do is we want to initialize our list of items using this data. So at the beginning of our app, when the screen one is starting up, what we want to do is we want to query the TinyDB and see if there is some stored data or not. If we do get some stored data, we want to initialize this list with the stored data that we just read from the TinyDB. If on the other hand there was no data, this empty list is going to be overwritten by another empty list. So now what we want to do is we want to show all the data that was there in the TinyDB. And in order for us to display the data in the list view, we use this block before. So I'm going to copy and paste this block again and place that within this. So this completes this whole app where we will be able to insert and delete items and store that data persistently.